Some board game hobbyists like to track every single play of every single game that gets to the table. I'm not exactly sure why they do this, other than maybe they like to keep some interesting stats about which games are playing most often and which games aren't getting played. I don't really know. I have never done it myself, up until last month when I thought it might be interesting to put out a video near the beginning of every month talking about what games I had acquired in the previous month, as well as which games I've played, and some brief thoughts on the games based on those plays. So this is the first month that I'm attempting this, and it just so happens that March of 2019 was an unusually active month both for game purchases and game plays. So I have quite a few things to go over for just 1 month's worth of board game stuff, so let's get right to it. My first purchase of March was an expansion for Isle of Skye called Isle of Skye Druids. If you happen to catch the video I posted recently about games that I'm selling, you'll have noticed that I am going to be selling the other expansion for Isle of Skye called Journeyman, because I felt like it added a lot of complexity to the game. At least it looked like it did. I hadn't had a chance to actually try the expansion, but it just added so much to a very simple and easy flowing game, whereas Druids doesn't quite add as much, but what it does add looks pretty interesting to me. So I'm looking forward to trying Isle of Skye sometime with the Druids expansion. The next thing I purchased was another expansion for another really awesome base game. This one is called The Quest for El Dorado, Heroes and Hexes. Now, The Quest for El Dorado is a super fun and simple Reiner Knizia game. It's a race game based on deck building. The base game of The Quest for El Dorado is really fun, a great experience, a really fun race game. The really only workable strategy with the base game is to not purchase cards except for when you cannot move forward, basically using your cards to move every time, and if you have some money, maybe occasionally purchasing a better card. And that's something I did test out over several plays, trying different strategies, and I was really hoping that the expansion would add more to the game so that that wasn't the sole strategy. I am not too fond of the hexes part or the curses part of this game. I don't like games that add negative effects necessarily. I much more enjoy a positive effect in a game. And so the hexes part I'm going to be pretty hesitant to play with, but I've already managed to play the game using some of the added stuff for the base game, just the extra cards, but leaving out all the curses stuff. So there is some really fun stuff. It does add to the variety a bit. I did also find that the base game needed a bit more variety within the marketplace of available cards, and it does add a few more of those, not a lot, but some anyhow. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I get to my plays of the month, so I better put that aside for now. Next, a Kickstarter arrived in the mail. This is another expansion, in fact, for Villages of Valyria. The expansion that I had kickstarted was called Landmarks and Architects, and what I didn't realize was that it only adds a handful of cards for the $50 or whatever I spent on the Kickstarter. And as much as I really do love the artwork on this expansion box, I'll show you the back of it as well, especially compared to the original base game box, which is pretty boring. The fact is, all the cards fit very easily within the base game box, even all of the extra Kickstarter stuff I have acquired over a couple of Kickstarters. So I've got this kind of big empty box that I'll have to decide whether I want something more compact and fits more easily on the shelf, or something where I like the artwork a lot more and maybe just pile everything into here. I don't know, but this is another expansion, the third expansion I guess that I have acquired this month. But enough about expansions. There are also two huge games that I picked up this month, and that's why I'm saying that March was an especially and unusually big month for game purchases. And I guess in the back of my head I must have had the fact that I have this huge pile of games that I'm going to be auctioning in the near future, and kind of spending ahead of time that money that will be coming in at some point. But one thing was a co-purchase with a couple of friends. So my legacy game group, which consists of myself, my wife, and two of our dear friends, we've played through Pandemic Legacy Seasons 1 and 2, and we just finished Charterstone. And so we were looking for another legacy game, and we settled on this beast called Aeon's End Legacy. None of us has played any of the previous Aeon's End games, so it's all new to us, but apparently the legacy version of the game is a very easy way to approach the system because it starts you off very simply, and as the campaign progresses it adds more and more to the game, and so it's kind of a gradual learning curve rather than jumping into the whole thing at one time. So this is a big one that we all sort of pitched in together on to work through together with the legacy group. And then the final purchase for March was another big game, and this one I got with an eye towards playing with my wife and kids as a slightly legacy style campaign game. This one is called Dawn of Peacemakers. And the primary reason I decided to pick up this big, expensive game is because I loved the thematic premise of the playing characters being individual heroes whose task is to stop a war that is occurring between various animal factions. And I also love the fact that it is a campaign game where as each scenario is played, new things are unlocked and discovered and added to the game and change the game in various ways. So it's really cool that while my kids have been watching our group play through various legacy games, they haven't been able to participate before, but now this is one we can do together and work through together and hopefully enjoy being peacemakers together. So those are all my purchases for March, which is more than enough for 1 month, obviously. And after the break, I'll come back and talk about my gameplays. Oh, wait. I don't have any ads or sponsors. I'm doing all this for free. Okay, so let me just move these pile of games aside, and I'm going to talk about the games that I played in March. And we're back. I hope you enjoy this ad-free content. And the first thing I have to do is make a correction. I'm not actually going to be talking about the expansion for the Quest for El Dorado until next month, because it was actually early April when I played with the new Heroes and Hexes expansion, so that's something to look forward to with my next video. I'll also add that I was going to come up with a highlight of the month, but it turns out it's too hard to do because there were some really special times within this past month with different people playing different games, so it's going to be a little too difficult to pick out a favorite, and I'll just jump straight into the games that I played. The first ones I'll talk about are a couple that I played strictly two-player with my wife. We don't often get a chance to play games together anymore, especially with how busy we've been, how tired we are all the time. It's just hard to find that energy to sit down and get a game played. But we did, first of all, early in the month, play a game that I had gotten for my wife's stocking at Christmas time, which is the terribly named Oh My Goods. And we had played this a number of times previously, so it wasn't our first game of this, and it's been a big hit with us. It's a little card game with a lot going on in it. The first edition of the game had some big problems that they corrected with this second edition, and by adding a couple of expansion elements, even though we don't actually have the expansion, plus a couple other sort of house rules, we have opened up the game even more than the second edition did, and made it such that it is easier to get something big going by the game end and some cool interactions between the buildings you've built and that sort of thing. So there's, I guess, more of a sense of accomplishment by the end of the game in the way we play this one. And so there's a lot to think about with this, and it's a good little game. Going much bigger now, I finally got the Golden Ages played with my wife. So this is a civilization themed game that, when it's all set up on the table, looks like there's just so much going on. There's just cards everywhere, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of symbology, but when you actually get into the game and start playing and get a feel for it, there's really not a lot of rules overhead, and once you kind of understand what the symbols and the iconography mean, it's really quite an easy game to play. Now, it did take a little longer than I was expecting. I think it must have taken us a few hours from start to finish, even though the game lasts only 4 ages and the first couple are pretty quick. By the time you get to that 3rd and 4th age, there is a lot going on in the game, and so the time it takes to get through those ages really exponentially increases. But the good news is that both my wife and I loved this game. This is the light Civ game that I've been dreaming of, and once we're more used to the game, we're going to be able to get that playtime down considerably. And it does take the entire scope of civilized human history and boil it down into a really simple, relatively fast playing experience. So when we don't have an entire afternoon and evening to devote to a game of Clash of Cultures, which is a game both of us love even more, we can at least break out the golden ages and play it again. I will add too that I managed to track down the very hard to find Cults and Cultures expansion, and we played with that right away because it does add some really good things to the game without adding a great deal more complexity or more things to track. What it does add, I think, really improves and enhances the gameplay, so I wouldn't want to play without that expansion. So big thumbs up from my wife and I for the Golden Ages. And next I'll jump into games that I've been playing with the kids. And first of all, we have gotten through all 12 scenarios in the base game of Arcadia Quest. So we have played 2 entire campaigns, myself and my 2 boys, and we have completed all 12 scenarios. And so we've essentially completed the base game, and we are all very much looking forward to going on to one of the campaigns from Arcadia Quest Riders or Arcadia Quest Pets, which are on the shelf waiting to be added to the game. Arcadia Quest has been a huge hit with the kids and with me. We've had a lot of fun with it. I do find by the end of a single game of it, all the dice rolling and just kind of waiting around to see what happens does sort of feel like the game drags a bit. But I'm always excited when we get the next scenario set up and we're ready to play again. It's always just a fun experience. So this is what will be coming up in a future play with the kids. Mind you, depending on how quickly I get the 4 heroes from Dawn of Peacemakers painted up, that game might end up taking over our family gaming for a little while and put Arcadia Quest to the side. But we'll see how the painting goes. I'm an incredibly slow painter. Just one of those time-consuming things that I never seem to get to, even though I really want to. So moving on to other kids and family gaming. Now we have Brain's Family, Burgen and Drachen. So Brain's Family is a whole series of puzzle games by Reiner Knizia. I guess a few of them are strictly solo puzzling experiences, but this one is for 2 to 4 players, and it's designed to be played as a family. And truthfully, this was totally an impulse purchase from a recent family getaway. We did a little weekend getaway. We checked out a board game shop, and I saw Reiner Knizia. I saw a cool looking game title. I saw the fact that it is a tile laying game, and just decided to give it a shot. And so we did break it out and play it, and it turns out it's a really interesting sort of tile laying race thing where you're kind of racing with the other players to make connections to castles and dragons that are on your individual player mats. And I normally dislike real-time stuff, but this really has a very interesting catch-up mechanism where each time you win a game, for you personally, your next puzzle becomes much harder, and so another person then is more likely to win and perhaps catch up and get to that same point, and their puzzle becomes harder. And then by the third round, it actually becomes very difficult to complete a puzzle for the third round. Even for my wife and I, we could spend easily a good 5, 6, maybe 7 minutes moving tiles around trying to puzzle through how to exactly make all the correct connections, which tends to give the kids time to catch up if they also haven't reached that third level, although if they have, it's kind of a struggle for them. My youngest kid, my 7-year-old, got kind of bored and frustrated with the game. He wasn't as quick to make all the puzzle-y connections as the rest of us, and so he ended up not being into this one. But my 9-year-old loved it. He really enjoyed this type of logical puzzling. So it's an interesting game that I found myself actually slightly interested in, just going through each of the different setups and seeing if I could work out the puzzles of the connections. But I'm certainly not going to spoil that for myself or practice without playing with other people. And then one weekend I did a little bit of 2-player gaming with my 9-year-old while the youngest one was out at a play practice. And one game he requested was Dungeon Mayhem, which is a little wee card game where up to 4 players can each control their own little hero and essentially play cards to try to get the other hero's lives down to 0 before your own life is brought to 0. And it's one we've broken out a few times and enjoyed, but when I started playing again with my 9-year-old, he got right into it. He found one character that he particularly enjoyed playing because each of them are actually asymmetrical. They each have different powers and abilities. Even though it's a very simple game, it's pretty neat that they were able to incorporate that sort of asymmetry with each of the characters. And so we just kept playing over and over again and having a good time with this little wee card game. The other one that he and I played together is a game that is totally a throwback to my own childhood. This game, Codebreaker, in my day was called Mastermind. It's one that I recall playing with my mother when I was a young kid, and it's a very simple logical deduction game, and again, with my older logical kid, it was right up his alley. Once he started to figure out how the clue system worked and how you were able to deduce incorrect and correct placement of the pegs, he really started to get into it a lot. And I was glad that he was enjoying it. It's one that they had gotten for Christmas, and I wasn't sure if they would get into it or not, but my 9-year-old certainly was enjoying that a lot as I dump Dungeon Mayhem all over my table. Now there's one final game I'll talk about in relation to my kids, although the first play of it was with adults, with other friends. So my friend went in big on the Kickstarter for Fireball Island. Now Fireball Island is an old game, I assume from the 80s, and it's a gigantic game where you have this big 3D island. Your adventurers are trying to race around collecting stuff, and periodically you're dropping balls which follow down grooves and perhaps knock over adventurers. And I guess for a lot of gamers there's a real nostalgia factor there, although myself, I had never played the game as a kid, but I guess my friend had, so she got all the Kickstarter stuff and brought it over and we gave it a try. It was fun to try, even though pretty much 100% of the fun of the game is rolling a marble and seeing if it knocks somebody over. And then she was kind enough to leave it at our house so that I could then pull it out with the kids and play with the kids, and of course they had fun with it too. I did find though, with each subsequent play of Fireball Island, the fun factor kind of dropped off more and more. It was kind of an interesting novelty and fun to try, definitely, but there's really not enough game there to sustain that level of interest, particularly when you take into account the amount of time it takes to set up the island and all the bits and pieces that go with it. All in all, it was a fun thing to do with the kids. It was a fun thing to try. The nostalgia isn't there for me to really have that level of enjoyment with it, so I'm happy to leave it for now. And I'll finish up with 2 games that we played with some other friends of ours. And they enjoy it when I teach them games, so I guess they had received Betrayal at Baldur's Gate as a Christmas present. And in the distant past, my wife and I had played the original Betrayal at House on the Hill. So I was able to teach them Betrayal at Baldur's Gate recently. The four of us played together. It was kind of funny because at the beginning of the game, my wife was kind of complaining about the fact that when we played Betrayal at House on the Hill, she was always the traitor, and sure enough, she was the traitor again. And she actually hates it, whereas I'm like, come on, give me a chance to be the traitor. Although, since I was teaching the game, that wouldn't have been a great thing, probably. And it played out kind of very weirdly in that the haunt was triggered very early in the game with not much of the map explored or items gathered. However, that worked out to be a huge advantage for the non-traitor characters because their goal was to, I think, destroy items or something like that. So the game was over real quick. As it turns out, a couple of us were having some health issues, weren't feeling that great, so it was probably good that it wrapped up pretty quickly, and it was great for an initial learning game. But I think we all enjoyed that particular gameplay, and I imagine we'll be doing more adventures of Betrayal at Baldur's Gate in the future. And then finally, the man in that couple has been really getting into Magic the Gathering, and he asked me if I was interested in starting to come over on a weekly basis to do a noon-hour game of Magic. And I've never played Magic the Gathering before. As soon as that word got out, my geek membership was revoked immediately. But he taught me the game and I stumbled through my first play a bit. We've done a couple of more games since then, so I'm starting to get a feel for it now. And I will say that I'm really enjoying the experience because it gives me an opportunity to hang out with this guy for an hour on a weekly basis and play a game. As far as Magic itself goes, I don't get the whole hype for the game, although admittedly I've only played a few times with one single starting deck. My very early initial impression is that it feels like so much depends on what cards you draw and then basically just playing the highest card you can based on the mana you have available to you, which for much of the early game is not much at all. Now, I'm sure that an experienced Magic player could come at me with any number of arguments, such as the fact that if you're playing poker, for instance, yeah, a lot depends on the cards you draw, and yet a skilled player will win almost all of the time, just as is the case with Magic. And the fact that we're playing with pre-made decks means that we're basically eliminating much of the strategic depth of the game. I think that the strategy of the game lies in how you put your deck together, I would imagine, and then the tactics would come into play as you're actually playing the game, drawing cards, and having to deal with a changing situation with each card you draw and each round that passes. So what we're doing is basically a very low strategic game and a highly tactical game. And yeah, I admit that there were a couple of times where I had a few interesting options that had very differing results potentially, depending on how I decided to play my cards. And so I'm sure there is a lot there to explore, more than I could ever imagine, in fact. But as of right now, I'm just kind of meh with the game, although I am having a lot of fun playing it with my friend. So that's it for my March games played. A lot there, like I said. As far as my new to me stuff to recap, we had the Golden Ages with the Cults and Culture expansion was new to me, was a huge success. The Brains Family, Burgen and Drachen, that little puzzle game was new to me and was enjoyed by my 9-year-old in particular. There was Fireball Island, which was fun to try, but I'm pretty much done with it. There's Betrayal at Baldur's Gate, which ended up being kind of a weird scenario, but seems to be a fun game to play with our group. And then Magic the Gathering, which was just kind of so-so as far as game-wise, but for the experience, I've been having a lot of fun with it. So I'm really interested in knowing what games you have acquired in the past month and what you've been playing lately, especially your highlights. What have been recent highlights for you? Please do let me know in the comments. And I'll come back in another month and tell you about April. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. If you wouldn't mind just crushing that like button, smashing that subscribe button, and chucking the link for this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, by golly, I would appreciate that. Cheers. As well as all the games that I had played in that period of... totally spit when I said played. The review that shut up and put down, that would be pretty mean. Oh yeah, that's what I can call it. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed those messages. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed those. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed those messages from my sponsors. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed those messages. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed those messages from my sponsors. And we're back. I hope you enjoyed this ad. And the first time it takes to get through those ages is really exponential. Mind you, depending on how quickly I paint the 4 heroes from, what's it called? I don't think it's kind of neat that they were to. So she went, and I have to say that it was fun. And well, they're actually be notable exceptions. Oh my god, I haven't been trying to. And I will first jump into games that I played 2 players with my wife. That's actually not what I wanted. Why am I spitting when I'm talking?